Welcome, listener, to our roundtable discussion where once and for all we're going to figure out what is cozy fantasy. This is Sebastian Nothwell, and I am joined by R.K. Ashwick,
Hi.
Noah Hawthorne,
Hello.
Esso Callahan,
Hello.
Sarah Wallace,
Hello.
and Tess Carletta.
Hiya.
And so, beginning with R.K. Ashwick, what is cozy fantasy?
Oh God. Wow, you're just straight up asking the question. Okay, I regret wanting to go first. I think it's been talked about a lot in many different circles, and especially in the cozy fantasy subreddit, which I really enjoy. But I think the general consensus is that there actually are no hard and fast rules. It is a squidgy genre, kind of by definition. There are definitely some main tropes and vibes that are very common, a lot of common settings, common characters. But there is a lot of room for interpretation, which I think is actually really great for authors because then you're not kind of constricted into a sub genre that can't go anywhere else. Yeah, so I guess my definition is that there's no definition. Wow, that's not helpful at all. I'm doing great. Does anyone else have anything they want to say?
We now know just how vast the scope of the question is.
Yup.
I mean, playing off of that, the first thing I had was it's mostly vibes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the big thing with cozy fantasy, I find it's very theme strong. So there's a lot of common themes like wholesomeness, found family, healing, love, and friendship. So you can kind of fit those anywhere, which I think gives that vague definition or doesn't help anyway. But that's what I find is like a common thread between cozy genres, not so much as fantasy, but just in general with cozy.
It is an extremely vibes-based subgenre.
Mm-hmm. I do agree on the commonality between the themes, though, and how heavily it's vibes based. Because I think when a lot of people try to strictly define it in certain settings, like, oh, it has to be slice of life, it has to be low spice, it has to be low stakes or low conflict. There are examples in the genre of high spice, like Kimberly Lemming, a little bit darker, like Emily Wilde, a little bit higher stakes, or high action, like Can't Spell Treason. You know, it's certainly not always slice of life. So yeah, it's really more amorphous just in terms of what links all of those together.
I would agree with that. Esso Callahan, how would you define cozy fantasy?
I don't know if there's actually a definition. I agree definitely that it's vibes. And also I think just it goes, with the name, cozy, like it's a feeling. It's not necessarily one thing that you're reading or experiencing, but it's just like the feeling that you have when you're in that story. So, to me, cozy stories make me all warm and fuzzy inside, and they have characters that I fall in love with, and you have hope. You're excited to see what happens, and yeah, I think that's it for me. It's just the vibes and cozy feeling that you get with the story.
We may be dealing with an extremely subjective subgenre from the sounds of it.
For sure.
I think there's a lot of emotions involved. Like that's what draws to people the most.
Mm.
And you don't need high stakes to create that. And when you have that like closer view, where you're like everything's kind of under a magnifying glass instead of being from this far perspective, you're kind of more concentrated on the characters and their emotions.
And that might be why it blends so well with romance as a genre, because romance is also very much based around the characters' emotions first and foremost. Sarah Wallace, how would you define cozy fantasy?
So, to answer that specific question, I also agree that it's hard to pin it down, and I think it's mostly vibes. But what I came up with when I was anxiety planning for this episode is I think at its heart and core, I feel like cozy fantasy is hopeful in spirit and comforting in spirit, which I think is why it's so nebulous to define because everyone is comforted by different things. And I think for a lot of people, nostalgia can be comforting. So there are books that some people might not rate as cozy because it doesn't feel comforting to them, but for other people it does. So I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard, why there's so many definitions and then books that defy those definitions, because everyone's perspective of or perception of what is cozy in the word itself, like what feels cozy and what feels comforting, is different. But I think what I believe is the through line for all of it is something that has hope and light at the core of it. And Meg's Tea Room, who talks exclusively about cozy fantasy, once defined it as a soft place to land, which I thought was a pretty good description of it.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, because then you know when reading it, similar to a romance novel, that it's going to end happily. And you know that it's kind of a safe read in that it's a soft place to land is kind of a nice way to put it. Because no matter what goes through the story, you know it's going to end well.
I really like that phrase.
Yeah, me too.
It's a very forgiving definition because once you have that ending locked in, you can pretty much go anywhere and still kind of fall within that.
Yeah, because it's the landing that's important, not the journey.
Tess Carletta, how would you define cozy fantasy?
Well, now my definition feels controversial because I treated it like it was a homework assignment and I wrote down a dictionary definition of what it seemed like to me. And it's not the opposite of what everyone has been saying, but it does contradict some of what has been said. So I have an escapist, low stakes, low conflict story in which the characters earn their happy endings in a way that provides the reader peace and or comfort. And then the only difference with cozy fantasy would be that would include some level of magic.
That is amazing.
Really?
Yes, that's amazing.
Yes.
You could take the girl out of grad school.
Episode over, we've nailed it.
We're done, everybody. Go home.
The overall common points I was able to glean from looking at cozy fantasy as a whole and what books were getting kind of tossed under this particular umbrella is that slice of life comes up a lot, but then again, life comes in a lot of forms, and every slice is going to look very different from every other slice.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to most dealt with low fantasy, so focus less on high kings and powerful wizards and more on middle and working class heroes, but less grim than I find most low fantasy in general.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I would definitely say it skews that way, even if it's in a high fantasy setting. I think the characters are not necessarily the typical protagonists.
Yeah, they're not necessarily the people who tend to control the fate of the world or are the chosen one necessarily, but...
Yeah. They're not like the level 20 wizards.
Exactly.
Something that I was thinking about when everyone was giving their definitions, and I don't know if this will end up popping up in the research that you've done, Sebastian, but I wonder if there's a different definition for cozy fantasy that readers have compared to what the market itself, what publishers would consider cozy fantasy. There's a lot of books that I don't know that are necessarily marketed by their publishers or by, their street teams as cozy, but then they end up being accepted as cozy or comfort reads.
It's reader recommended.
Well, yeah, or if it's subjective and a reader reads something and they're like, well, this was cozy to me, so it must be cozy fantasy. And the author might be looking at that going, well, I didn't think that was going to be cozy. Kind of like when I said your books were cozy, Sebastian, and you were like, there's the removal of internal organs. What do you mean it's cozy?
There's a lot of evisceration for cozy in my books.
To be fair, in Emily Wilde Encyclopedia, there is evisceration in that, but that pops up frequently in the cozy list. I would say that's on probably the darker end, but it's still there.
That's the cozy horror. Yeah, that's the cozy horror.
And a quick note too, because you said earlier that low fantasy you would consider grim, which I tend to write, I think, in low fantasy. So I never think of it as grim, so I thought that was a fascinating description. But when we had sort of talked about this before, you had mentioned, we've discussed Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell a little bit, and you had kind of mentioned that you would consider Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell cozy, and I would not. But I consider O King Holly King cozy because I think O King Holly King at its core is hopeful and comforting at the heart of a story. This romance, I would say, has a comforting heart to it. Whereas Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, for me, the overall vibes for that story felt very sinister.
Mm.
The magic is very sinister and the Fey realm is very dark. And so that one does not feel cozy to me because I felt discomfited the entire time reading it. In a good way, but that one didn't feel cozy to me because of that.
I felt like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell had a very soft landing, though I'll admit it was a soft landing I was not expecting until I reached it, at which point it delighted me.
I hated the ending. I thought it was not a very happy ending. So
Really?
yeah,
Wow.
I was really bummed out by the ending.
Conflict in the ring.
Well, yeah, kind of just fight to the death over that one.
But some people enjoy thunderstorms and other people enjoy a nice clear spring morning. And I think that's the difference between like traditionally accepted cozy and things like dark academia or the cozy horror. Like it was said before, like people find different things cozy, and they're all comforted in different ways.
So I think Sarah is onto something with what they were saying, especially with the example of Oak King and Holly King, because for those of the listeners or maybe even the people in the chat who haven't read that book, the main two characters have this very dire circumstance kind of hovering over their head that seems like it's going to come to pass in some way or another. But as a reader, at least, I don't know for you as the writer, but as a reader, it felt to me like the characters were concerned about that and they knew that they needed to act to prevent the big looming circumstance, but they just kind of trusted in each other and had hope and had a lot of like love for each other and prioritized their relationship and their future as opposed to panicking about this, oh no, what if we have to duel to the death sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's such a tender romance. Yeah.
Right. And if you had wanted to make it less of a cozy novel, then I think you would have leaned more into the we have to get trained up because he's going to have to fight to the death and this is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen, as opposed to we are two dudes in a forest making love, trying to survive. And so you can think whatever you want because you wrote the book. But I think that that's just kind of why it's cozy, probably for me and Sarah especially.
I'm with Tess on this one.
It also opens with a bloody tournament field, though. So, like...
Well, what did they do on that tournament field, Sebastian? What did they do?
A lot of murder.
Among other things.
And then what? That's for the reader to find out.
And
Well, so Sebastian, if I recall, like, O King Holly King starts out with a fight, yes, but there are definitely other cozy fantasies, really like Legends and Lattes and Cursed Cocktails, where they start out kind of in the fight and in the battle, just to show, like, this is the character's background, this is what's going on, and then it pivots. I don't think that in and of itself keeps it from being cozy.
Okay.
Well, and I put this in my notes too, where I wrote that many cozy fantasies start out with the darker elements. Like, there can be darker elements in cozy fantasy, but they're usually at the beginning. Like, so for Kit and Basie, it's the euthanasia in chapter 1, but then it never pops up again. Or like
the euthanasia.
the euthanasia.
Here we go again.
Oh my god. And then with Pip,
Yes.
the education of Pip, that starts out with, like, obviously Pip has gone through a very rough time, but then it gets better.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's kind of like a recurring thing in cozy fantasy as well.
It's that healing journey, yeah.
Yes.
It also helps with the contrast of what Sarah was saying about the soft place to land.
Yes.
Like, if you're starting in that darker place and then you're ending in the softer place, it's narratively more satisfying.
It makes you care about the characters. It makes you invested in their story because you're like, oh my gosh, my heart is broken for them. It better, it can only go up from here, right?
Yes.
Right.
So you're kind of front-loading all of the misery in the narrative and then just kind of going on an upward track towards that soft place to land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now you're on it.
I've added front-loaded misery to my notes.
Which, starting off with a bloody tournament field definitely qualifies. And I think to jump off the idea of, like, the romance, there's a lot of overlap, I think, like you mentioned before, between cozy fantasy and romance. And I think that even with romance, when there can be a lot of angst, the one defining feature for a romance really is that it has to end happily for the couple, or the characters, not always a couple. But, like, so I think with cozy fantasy, with the soft place to land as a kind of a good starting point for definition at the very least, is that, like, the ending. So, like, it doesn't matter how much the angst or the action is front-loaded or even in the middle. It doesn't really matter. If a book is marketed as cozy, you know that at the end of the book, and, like, even if it's not marketed as cozy, when you read a book and you feel like it's cozy, you know it's going to end in a good place. Similar to romance novels, where you have this surety that it's going to have a happily ever after. I feel like cozy fantasies kind of have to end happily or doesn't feel cozy, I would say.
I would agree with that. In my notes, I had written down, and I promise I did actually take notes despite me coming out of the gate just talking about what cozy fantasy wasn't. I took notes on how one of the through lines is positive and comforting relationships. And that can be, platonic or familiar or romantic. It doesn't mean that there isn't conflict between characters or flaws or angst or anything like that, but I think a lot of the coziness comes from characters supporting each other and being kind. And I think that does a lot of heavy lifting if you have a higher stakes cozy, because you still have those characters and those relationships to kind of lean on for those vibes.
Oh, I love that.
So the world can be kind of crapsack, but they have like a support structure amongst themselves that helps them face all of that.
Yeah. And I fully admit that I did not finish reading Strange and Normal, but
It's a beast. So.
and it was years ago. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I recall, if I'm remembering the book, I'm not remembering, oh, I really liked the relationship between these characters. I remember a lot of characters just kind of disliking each other.
Yeah.
And I think that contributes to it not feeling cozy.
Yeah, I agree with that. There are some good relationships in there, but from my memory of reading it too, I feel like even like Jonathan and his wife have a good romance, but it does have some like fraught and tension to it because she doesn't really want him to go down the path he's going. And they do have a good romance and a solid relationship by the end of the book, but like I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, Sebastian, but I feel like they do go through some tension and conflict between them. And until like the third act of the book, you don't really get any strong, powerful friendships that feel like they will make it through the odds kind of thing. Like I think in the final act of the book, you do get like Jonathan Strange's wife makes a friendship that is a very powerful one that's really good and is one of my favorite parts of the book, but like it takes a while to get there.
I can't form any counter arguments without spoiling the
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
Sorry I brought that one up. That was a hard one to talk about.
Well, looks like Sarah's automatically right.
Ding, ding, ding.
I did have a thought about cozy, like, kind of, again, as I was stressed note-taking last night, it occurred to me that cozy fantasy has it wasn't invented in the recent years. It's been a genre for a long time. But I think recent years is when we've seen books marketed towards adults that are cozy fantasy. Prior to recent years, we've got like Howl's Moving Castle, The Hobbit, Wind in the Willows, I would probably argue is cozy fantasy. But those are all children's books, or at least written with children in mind. Howl's Moving Castle kind of straddles a few age groups, but cozy fantasy, I think what makes it kind of a unique one is I feel like the reason it's gained such popularity recently is because it feels like it's readers, adult readers, who want books that feel the same comforting, cozy feel that they felt when they read books as kids. But they don't necessarily want to read kids' books. They want to read adult books that give them the same feels that they got when they read kids' books. I think there's a lot of wealth of cozy fantasy within middle grade and young adult, but people don't necessarily tap into that because they're trying to find cozy fantasy in the adult genre, which definitely I think that's why this kind of feels like an emerging genre, even though it's not, because it's kind of an emerging genre as an adult genre, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that.
I do wonder if Howl's Moving Castle gets thrown into children's literature. Is it just that it's written by a woman? Like, are we...
No, I don't think so. It's because I think it's marketed as, I think, middle grade or young adult.
Right, but books written by women tend to get pushed into young adult even when they're not young adult.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, most of Diana Wynne Jones's books were.
Yeah.
I think it's the other reason, is that all of her other books that I've read were middle grade or young adult.
But like Sophie's a full-on adult, which should put her into new adult at the very least.
Yeah, there aren't really a ton of like typical modern YA tropes in that book.
Yeah.
That said, I definitely read it like as a kid.
Yeah. It feels kind of YA to me in terms of age group because of her age. I think she's right at the age that young adult readers would read that protagonist age group, if that makes sense.
It's also like children's literature as a genre is so new, and middle grade and young adults specifically are even newer than that. So it's like, are all of the old books that we would consider cozy actually children's books, or are they books that were written for everyone that were then reclassified as children's books as literature grew as a market and everything got kind of age gated?
I'm looking at you, Anne of Green Gables.
Well, you know that Little Women is marketed to kids now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Isn't Little Women for girls?
Yeah, they're all teens, and by the standards of the time they were in, they were like teens on the cusp of starting their own household, so it would be like,
that's true.
To someone in the 1860s, this would be a new adult novel.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was taking notes last night of all the children's books that I would consider cozy fantasy, and some of them were written by women, but then you've got like Lloyd Alexander and Edward Eager and like the Oz series. Oh, Frank Baum was quite problematic, so I'm not necessarily recommending the Oz books, but that whole series is very cozy in vibes. But, like, I think a lot of those books, though, the protagonists are usually pretty young, so those still do feel like children's books to me. But I do see what you mean, if they were to be reclassified now.
I think an interesting little kind of middle point, of course I'm going to bring up Anne of Green Gables.
Yes.
Oh.
Because that one starts out, Anne is like, oh, I forget how old she is. She's young, though. She might be like 10.
Yeah.
I said 10 or 11.
Yeah. And then by the last book in the series, she is like in her 50s and she's married and her kids are becoming adults.
Yeah.
It's still a children's book. It's still a young adult book. And I don't know if Ella Montgomery necessarily intended for the first one to be for children, but it definitely became a children's book about young girlhood and queer subtext.
That's true. And, like, The Hobbit, too, was written with children in mind, but the main character is middle-aged.
Right.
Explicitly so, yes.
Explicitly middle-aged. And yet it was written for children in mind. So it's a kind of a weird... I think there's a crossover between romance and cozy fantasy, and I think there's also a crossover between children's fantasy and cozy fantasy, too. That is pretty fascinating.
And here's another thing, is I feel like people are more aware of, like, their mental health and self-care and wanting to read just to feel good, and reading has become more popular. We were all kind of traumatized by COVID and everything before and since then, and there's kind of more of a need, I feel like, to just take care of yourself mentally and read something that, you know, is like a cinnamon roll. You like your epic fantasies and you like all your big books, but sometimes you just need something a little bit different.
You just need some cozy evisceration on a bloodstained tournament field.
That's all you need sometimes.
You do, Sebastian. You do.
Listen, I am loving Fiorenzo, and I was so taken aback by that one. That in the beginning, I'm cringing for like 1% of it and feel like I might be sick. And then the rest of it's great. I'm like, this is Pretty Woman.
I got bad news for you, Noah. It's gonna be more than 1%.
I know. I'm like mildly spoiled and I'm not ready for it. But I consider the rest of it cozy, honestly. So far.
Yeah, the makeover scenes in Fiorenzo are very cozy. I don't know that much else is.
What do you mean?
Hurt comfort?
Yeah, they nurse each other back to health for like half the book. It's so sweet.
Yeah, but before that, they have to get into a position where they need to be nursed back to health, which I would argue
Yeah,
is
but they'll be
cozy.
fine. They'll be fine.
We're talking about front-loading the misery, Sebastian.
Yes.
Yeah, that one's less front-loaded and more just kind of gently folded in throughout.
We have a current live reaction. Noah's in the middle of the book and doesn't know how it ends, but he knows they're going to be fine.
Exactly.
I think that's the distinguishing thing, is that he feels confident.
For a certain value of fine, they will be fine.
Yes, but like they will be like with someone with O King Holly King, there's such a tender romance between them. They trust each other that you know as the reader that they're gonna get through it together one way or another.
Here's the thing, squad. Before I decided to write books, I decided I was going to be a psychologist. So I'm looking at this through diagnostic criteria. Okay, now I never did become a psychologist, but one thing I put in my notes is like, if cozy fantasy was a DSM-5 disorder that needed to be diagnosed, then one of the things that I think would need to be present in a hurt comfort book like Fiorenzo would be that the comfort has to outweigh the hurt 2-to-1.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a mathematical ratio, 2-to-1. That for like every one scene where someone gets hurt in one of Sebastian's books, there's like 1,000 more words like extra on top of that. Like there's pages and pages and pages of comfort.
There really is. Yeah.
Okay? I'm cooking.
That's what is cooking.
But it's the fluff, you know?
You know one thing we haven't chatted about yet though?
What?
Oh boy.
Manual labor?
Manual labor.
Oh!
Okay, I'm gonna set this scene. Many months ago, I had a review of Kit Basie where someone was like, I'm not quite sure what people mean by cozy fantasy. I think it might have something to do with manual labor. And we were all like, huh.
No, we were not all like, huh. I was all like, yeah, no, they're on to something.
Okay, I was all, huh? But they are onto something. Well, the huh is like a wow, we didn't think of it that way, but yeah, they're onto something. Because, yeah, they're onto something.
I mean, I read a lot of Regency romance where there's not a whole lot of manual labor involved in anything.
But there is manual labor involved because it's a pre-industrial society, so it's a much slower pace.
Okay.
Everything is kind of cozy by default.
Okay.
And everything is an artisan handcrafted good. There are no mass-produced products, so everything is by default made with at least passion and skill, if not love.
Okay. All right.
Right.
I'll take that.
It's all a labor of love.
Going off of that, I would say that if we're kind of expanding the concept of manual labor to just somebody like literally doing like a labor of love, Sarah, I think the research in Breeze Spells
Exactly.
would, like, I think that applies. Like, I know it's not the strict definition of manual labor,
Yeah, that makes
but
sense.
they are pouring a lot of energy into a smaller, more tangible project. And I think we see that a lot in like the standard like coffee shops, potion shops,
Yeah.
and other things like that. And so, yeah, I think if we're looking at a broader definition, I think it makes a lot of sense in the cozy world.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
That's why when you were like, oh, I don't think there's manual labor in these Regency books, I was like, there's so much with your hands in your books.
Letters Have Moon Street? What do they do? Well, I guess there's a lot of spell building with their hands, so I guess that would count.
There's it's about the craft.
Letters to Half Moon Street is, as the title implies, entirely made up of handwritten letters that are carried between their two houses, which means they can't just shoot off a text you up at 3 a.m. No, they have to sit down, compose, handwrite, which means it's not just impersonal text on a screen, it is their individual handwriting going back and forth to each other, and wax seals that they have to crack open by hand, that wonderful tactile experience.
Okay. You
Aesthetic.
make a compelling point. Compelling point. I like it.
I think there's focus and passion involved in that.
Exactly.
We might be tripping ourselves up on the word labor, and it might just be more of creation.
Creation is labor. Labor deserves to be paid.
Down, boy.
Right. I escaped containment for a second there. Continue.
But like in Legends and Lattes, there's like the creating of the coffee shop.
Yeah, there's a lot of manual labor.
Yeah.
Like in Kit Basie, it's like the creating, the tending to of the garden and any number of Kit's other many hobbies. But like just like things that are being created, or like in Becca's book, like with the potions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like they're doing that together.
And Fella Enchanted with all the baking.
I mean, really, what is it that all queers dream of? To have a bookshop, a cafe, a library, a cottage.
To make the things they love without having to pour their souls into a capitalistic society.
Exactly. But not only that, but to have it in an accessible place.
That's why so many cozy fantasies are queer.
Exactly.
Miss Morris by E.M. Forster, A Cozy Fantasy.
Although I will say something that's interesting is that what you were talking about earlier, Becca, about the relationships in cozy fantasy being central and like a core part of the definition. And so many queer books feature found family, that I think that is another key feature often of cozy fantasy, is that there's often a found family of some sort in there. Not always, but often.
I would agree with that.
Would we say connecting to nature is a common point or no?
Depends who you're talking to.
He has been summoned.
I can think of a lot of more urban-centered cozies that, like, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of, like, 2 coffee shop ones and then a bar one that don't really connect to nature just because of their setting. But I can think of plenty others that do involve nature.
I feel like nature's a really big one in Kit Basie and in Fella Enchanted.
For sure.
Just like the magic coming from specifically the land.
Yeah.
Certainly in Breeze Spells and Bridegrooms.
Yeah.
Explicitly so.
Yes, very much so. And that one is kind of sits on the middle too, because they're in London, aren't they?
Yeah, they're in London, so it's in the middle of a city, but then they also, fey magic draws from nature.
Right.
And they have these beautiful, expansive parks in which to practice magic together, and oh no, their hands have touched.
I was going to say, they do other things in those parks.
Inspired by nature, I'm telling you. There's a time.
Playing off of places, I feel like kind of the mundane and liminal places like that, like parks and just like places that we go every day and don't give a lot of thought to, are explored often in cozy stories, I find. Like, it's kind of branching out. It's not just cafes anymore. Everyone wants something different we've had a lot of coffee shop things, and they're still great stories, but I feel like people are kind of branching out and exploring other places like that.
I know it's at least in part the popularity of Legends and Lattes specifically, but I do wonder if there is so much cafe-centered cozy fantasy because everyone spent the last 20 years writing coffee shop AUs on AO3.
Yeah, maybe. The other coffee shop one I think of off the top of my head is Coffee, Milk, and Spider Silk. And then there's Cursed Cocktails, which is about a bar rather than a coffee shop, but a lot of similar overtures. Oh, Treason Without Tea. That's a tea shop. Bookshop and the Barbarian Bookstore, which may also have coffee.
I think it all just comes down to that more and more we're exploring the cozy, comforting familiarity of the everyday. Coffee shops, like they're embedded into our daily lives, especially the people who go every single day. But then, as Noah was saying, like all the things that are sort of mundane around us, like the park. Well, the park is part of, maybe we don't go every day, but it's a constant in our lives if you're in a place where there's access to a park. Like all those just things that, the things that we take for granted and put a little bit of magic and a little bit of comfort into them because they're familiar, because they're valuable to us.
There are also a lot of things we lost access to during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Which I think might explain some of the timing of these trends as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All of our third spaces getting closed down.
And I think, I forget who was saying earlier that, like, with the pandemic and that we've been in such a, like, kind of rough emotional state culturally, that it makes sense that the resurgence of cozy fantasy has happened when it has, because historically that's when these sorts of, media comes out. Similar to the romance. Romance has been kind of having a moment as well. I think that's probably similar.
Mm-hmm.
What is cozy fantasy not?
Oh.
I was trying to think of an answer to this question, and I was thinking about it all day long, and I couldn't come up with anything. So I give it to the professionals.
I guess I would say it's like just the opposite of grimdark. And so I feel like in grimdark there is a distinct lack of safety. So like, even the tavern that you go to, that's like a seedy, shady place where people are getting stabbed. And like, a lot of the relationships are either antagonistic or fraught. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of hurt, very little comfort. And so I think it's just... It's, really the like all those things on the opposite end of the spectrum.
So would Game of Thrones then be the antithesis of cozy fantasy?
I want to say yes.
Definitely ticks all the boxes in terms of, from what I've observed, the relationships are very fraught. There's not a lot of trust. Or broken trust.
Yeah, a lot of the good folks end up dying. And so there's very little like, oh, this relationship, I can, feel comfortable watching this relationship, because you don't know if they could suddenly just die in a minute or, get stabbed out of nowhere, get betrayed.
If they have a positive relationship, they're either about to betray each other or about to be betrayed by an outside force that's going to murder one or both of them.
Yes. Yes, I would say that there's no soft place to land.
It's a sharp place to land.
Sharp place to land.
Only sharp landings in Game of Thrones.
That's what I feel like. You don't, like, you suspect everybody to have bad intentions, but not so much in cozy books or cozy fantasy books. Or there's only like one that you're strongly suspecting, if there's kind of like mild stakes. But
I don't know if the stakes are mild so much as they are either deeply personal, or if they are larger stakes, they are removed. Because like in Howl's Moving Castle, there's a full-on war on and they're trying to get Howl to participate in it.
Yeah.
But it's always like one or two steps removed from what Sophie is doing.
Yeah.
Well, it's that narrative lens,
Yeah, the cozy narrative lens is usually much smaller in scope.
Are there any other examples that you wanted to bring up?
Earlier, when you shared your notes for this one, you had mentioned Redwall as an example, specifically because there are like mice, and so it's a high fantasy with high stakes, but it's cute little mice as the main characters, which I thought was a fascinating point because it made me wonder about like anthropomorphic animal characters. Does that count as cozy fantasy? And like what other, I don't know, like where the line is for that, because
I feel like with Redwall specifically, it's not just that they're cute little animals, but also that, like, the good guys are always good, the bad guys are always bad, and, like, there's no really gray morality, and there's no overall grim dark tone. Like, grim things happen to these adorable woodland creatures, but you ultimately know that good will prevail. And, like, even within the tiny mice with swords genre, you have, like, Mouse Guard, which is much more of a Game of Thrones approach to the Redwall genre.
Yeah, I was thinking of, what's the one? The bunny one.
Oh!
Oh, Watership Down?
Watership Down.
Watership Down, thank you.
Watership Down! Hey, speaking of books that should not be marketed for children.
Yes. Yes.
Watership
sure.
Down!
That was traumatizing.
That one is dark.
Did anyone read the Guardians of Ga'Hoole series with the owls?
No.
I am given to understand that the books were much darker than the film.
Oh, the film doesn't even begin to cover it. There was like 13 books.
Oh.
And they were insane. Like I would probably still read them. I would read them again. Like they have some really wild things that happen, and it's really dark, and there's some pretty serious themes dealt with. But because they're owls, it kind of, they're marketed middle grade, I think. So it's another one of those weird situations.
Yeah. Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim also, at least when I remember reading as a kid, felt dark.
Yeah.
No. This is why Sebastian thinks everything dark is cozy.
Because I experienced Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim far too young.
Yes.
And by comparison, everything else has been smooth sailing.
Yeah.
I mean, someone mentioned The Wind in the Willows. I just watched that with a friend of mine recently. Like the version where they took all the individual episodes and they smushed them all together to a movie, so it's really disjointed and the plot line doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And at the end, spoiler alert for this old beloved story, Portly, the little guy, gets like sacrificed or eaten by the god Pan and has to be brought back through the power of love. I'm like, imagine you're 7 and you see little Portly get chomped away. Not chomped away, it wasn't chomping, but like get swooped up, smited by a nature god. And then you're like, well, what if I go into the woods and Pan smites me? Like, then you end up like Sebastian.
We've taught children not to play in the woods now, haven't we?
I suppose. But poor Portly lives in the woods, so what's he supposed to do?
I do not remember that in the book, to be honest. Mostly in the book, I remember rowboats and breaking into houses and cute woodland creatures being friends.
And that's what I'm saying. Like, it's cozy and it's marketed for children, obviously. But then you watch the little movie edition and Portly's dead.
I mean, same with The Hobbit. Hobbit is very cozy in book form, not so much in trilogy form.
This is true.
I don't know that it should ever have been in trilogy form, but that's a discussion for another day.
But there's an example of what cozy fantasy is not, is the trilogy adaptation of The Hobbit.
Yeah.
All right. Do we feel like we've come to a consensus to a point? I do have written down, for cozy fantasy, you know how it ends before you begin.
Mm-hmm.
You have strong positive relationships between the characters despite outside peril.
Mm-hmm.
The comfort outweighs the hurt. Manual labor, and possible connection to nature or a slower way of life.
Sounds cozy to me.
I like all of these.
Yeah. Sign off.
And do you know what piece of media springs to mind when I think of all of these points?
Don't you dare say The Terror.
Are you gonna say it?
I knew it was coming. I knew it.
Season 1
Don't say
of
it.
AMC's cult classic horror series, The Terror. I know exactly how it's going to end when it begins, because it begins with the title card saying, by the way, all these guys are dead.
It's a soft place to land.
There's a strong positive relationship between the characters. Despite the outside influence, there is a beautiful queer romance where they are loving and supportive towards each other despite the outside circumstances, up to and including the marauding polar bear monster. The comfort does outweigh the hurt. There are some beautiful scenes of these men comforting each other when they're trapped in the Arctic wasteland. Manual labor, of course, this is the age of sail, and while they do have steam engines on board, they are largely used to heat the ships, and most of the power is done through men getting up in the sails and swinging ropes around. And, oh boy, are they connecting to nature whether they want to or not, because they're trapped in the Arctic with a magical polar bear monster.
I mean, I think horror as a comfort genre does come up a lot, because it is one where you know how it ends, and there are a lot of very strict genre conventions where, like, you know exactly what to expect. I just think that the setting and how, I guess, horrific it is kind of overshadows everything else that would make it cozy.
You tell him, Becca.
I don't know what those graphs are called where you have like, oh, what is it? It looks like a spider web almost, and like some parts are
yeah.
like higher than others. It's like if you made that with all of these different kinds of like common tropes, like for horror, it would be really skewed one way, and cozy, it would be skewed the other way. But that doesn't mean that there's not overlap in kind of those genre conventions. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yes.
Mhm.
It does.
Though I will say, the terror does have a lot of tender brow mopping and murmured reassurances between men who love each other.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but at the end, do you feel a sense of hope?
I do notice though that you left out the parts about soft place to land and hope at the core of the story. Yes.
I mean,
Was this whole episode just as a prelude to be able to
I started this podcast.
Mission completed.
I think if we're going to say that Fiorenzo and Oak King Holly King are cozy fantasy, then we do in fact leave the door open for me to drag the terror in kicking and screaming.
They are not comparable.
To be fair, I think cozy is in the eye of the beholder most of the time. So there are books that I do not consider cozy that are largely considered cozy, and there are books that I consider cozy that even the author sometimes would not agree. So, you know.
Sebastian, I think you just gotta put a pin into the terror and then save that conversation for a professional, and that's Carolina Cruz. I think you need to sit down with Nina and really hash this out. We are not the ones.
Fine. There is about a 10-minute cut of the terror that's just the gay romance part. And that's mostly cozy.
I'd watch that.
I know, you sent it to me.
Where is it? I need it.
I will link it in the chat after this podcast.
Nice.
I think Nina's intro episode though does actually cover a lot of like I don't know, like
Yeah.
horror genres and like that sort of thing, and about why those are potentially comforting and why those can actually cover certain topics, because it's like horror as kind of the gloves to handle that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Nina's able to talk about it a lot more eloquently than I can. So I recommend going back and listening to that episode for those of you who haven't. But yeah, I really liked their insights on that.
Absolutely, yes. I co-sign this.
Okay, this does make me think of an additional question. Do all of our definitions that we've kind of come up with for this episode, would they also cover other cozy genres, such as cozy sci-fi? And like, I've been wondering whether like steampunk could be considered cozy if the stakes and vibes fit. Same with like cozy paranormal. So like, would we say those are the same definitions fit all of the different cozy genres?
I think a lot of what we talked about here can apply.
I think it differs between subgenres, but there's still that overarching, you know there's going to be a happy ending, or you kind of know the ending in Sebastian's case. But I think so.
Because even Monk and Robot has a connection to nature.
I have seen people classify Howl's Moving Castle under steampunk.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, that's because of the movie.
That is probably mostly because of the movie.
The book is not remotely steampunk to me, at least. I don't know.
And when I think cozy steampunk, I do tend to think solar punk and hope punk, which are kind of reactions to the downtrodden industrial vibes of steampunk.
That's fair. I think of mostly the Parasol verse by Gail Carriger, which is
Oh.
largely cozy, and it's all steampunk, but it could potentially be classified as hope punk. I don't know.
See, I'm thinking of the books by Natasha Pulley, like the Watchmaker of Filigree Street and like the Bedlam Stacks. To me, that's like steampunk, especially with the little invention things that run on Steam, and I find it very cozy.
I had assumed because Watchmaker was in the name that it was clock punk rather than steampunk.
It's kind of both, because they run on clocks, but they're also powered by steam. Like, it's a multifaceted thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
These are all just words, folks.
And
At essence, the book is what it is, and then we're trying to like label something that is deeply profound and deeply unique.
Well, the thing about that is that books are also just words, so
Right.
I don't know what else we would use to describe them.
Your own feelings. When you read it, how do you feel? And then
It's all down to vibes again.
Yep.
It's vibes all the way down.
I was going to say, have we circled back to Oh,
It's all down to vibes.
And really, aren't we just a bunch of vibes, unlabelable vibes? I mean, who are we to put a label on?
I think, therefore, I vibe.
Yes. So, do we want to talk about our favorite cozy books?
Oh, I would love to.
I'm going to throw out Poised in Either Eye by Bee Pigeon and Fella Marsh. It is a dual POV romance between two dragons disguised as humans in not San Diego. And they're both disguised for different reasons, but they end up finding each other and having to work to get along, even though their personalities are totally opposite. And they end up both, I think, kind of working in the back of like a magic/psychic shop. It's very personal stakes. It's very small in scope. I love the dual POV between the two personalities because they're so massively different. They're so sweet. I definitely cried at one point while reading it. Highly recommend for something a little bit different than your standard, like, coffee shop, running a shop, cozy fantasy.
For me, it's the Lauren Lust series by Carla Nicole. It's vampires, but done in a way I haven't read before, and it's really cozy. And also, the author, you can tell that she's been, like, a lot of it has, like, Italian influences, and you can tell she's been there and the work she's put in. And a lot of the focus is on the characters' healing, the romance, but like the food and the architecture and just, I don't know, I just really like it. And then it's really cozy. And even though there's a lot of like inner turmoil, it's really nice to see them kind of grow and shed their skin, so to speak.
Oh, how do I pick just one? I don't know. See, for me, it varies so much because, like, I would say that I have a lot of comfort read cozy books that I'll go back to again and again and again just because I know what's going to happen and I know that it's just, like, happy throughout, like Sarah's books. But I also find a lot of like darker books to be quite cozy because for me it really is like having those stakes that make you like just attached to these characters and care about them so much. And one series that I think about that comes to mind is the Flos Magicae series by Arden Powell, and they actually write a lot of darker books, but this series in particular, it does have its moments that are a little bit grittier, but also it's just, I don't know, for me, a lot of nature going on, a lot of tender romance, and just kind of, a whole bunch of different situations throughout the different books. But that's what's cozy to me, really, is just like those stakes that make you care, and then just, I don't know, that warm, fuzzy feeling along with a lot of nature. So that's my answer.
For books that I haven't mentioned yet today, Sorcery and Cecilia or The Enchanted Chocolate Pot by Patricia C. Reedy and Caroline Stevermer. Epistolary Regency fantasy, so you can definitely tell that I got a lot of inspiration from it, or was very, very inspired after reading this trilogy. But they're very, very funny. They're very cozy, very sweet romantic fantasy series.
Well, right now I've been listening to Cat Sebastian's Seducing the Sedgwicks books. I think there's 3 of them. And I don't know if they're technically cozy, but I feel very cozy when I listen to it. And then I think everyone else says one, but I'm going to throw in a webtoon. If you're more of a visual comics person, there's a webtoon called Miss Abbott and the Doctor by Mari Paz Villar. And it's just very, very cozy. It's Regency, and it just basically tells the story about an eccentric, small-town woman in this Regency setting who falls in love with the uptight, grumpy doctor. And they start a little life together and have their little community around them.
Speaking of comics, my cozy recommendation would be the graphic novel series Castle Waiting by Linda Medley, which is a look at the secondary characters of fairy tales and what happens to them after the protagonists go off into the sunset with their happily ever after. It's very cute, very cozy, beautifully illustrated, and yeah, just kind of like sinking into a hot bath of a book.
Lovely.
Love it.
Also, AMC's The Terror.
Oh my god.
I love that every single note you wrote down during the whole thing was just to prove your point. You committed to that from the start.
Yeah, I know. I didn't see that coming.
You were scribbling so furiously, and I was like, what is he writing?
I know, I was wondering too.
Turns out, lies. Slander.
Honestly, bravo, quite frankly, because that was a twist none of us saw coming, and we should have.
Right. Round of applause. Round of applause.
Really, shame on us for not seeing that one a mile away. We had plenty of notice.
Oh my god.
It was all part of the plan.
It was like half an hour ago. I was thinking, why haven't we talked about the Terror yet? I'm surprised it hasn't come up. I should have known.
Yep.
You were just lying in wait.
He was building his case. Yep, building his case.
In fairness, I was also taking notes on others, but that is a corner of the page, yes.
Listeners, based off of the criteria today about tight-knit relationships and a lack of betrayal, I can safely say that this podcast episode is not a cozy fantasy.
God!
Wow. Wow.
I rest my case, Your Honor.
And on that note, final thoughts?
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It was fun. Oh, did we want to do our definition if it changed?
Oh yeah, sorry. That was a suggestion of mine. I don't know if we have to, because I don't know if it has changed.
I mean, as far as I know, the definition has changed to include the addendum except the terror, but...
Hey, no, because the terror does not have hope and comfort at its core. It's also not a soft place to land.
Period.
Again, I can't make a counter-argument without it spoiling the series, so...
But again, I would also argue cozy's in the eye of the beholder, so I will give Sebastian this one, but also I will definitely not be putting in any cozy rec roundups of my own.
Well, thank you, listener, for joining us on this high-stakes tale of betrayal, and...
Manual labor.
Don't forget the found family.
If folks feel particularly drawn to any of our arguments, where can they catch up with us online?
If you go onto our Right Here, Right Queer Instagram page, there's a link tree there. It has all of our individual Instagrams and our websites linked, as well as where you can find the podcast if you don't currently like where you're listening to it right now.